night, something taps beneath the old floorboards in a slow, patient rhythm that matches her heartbeat, as if whatever's under the house is keeping time with her. Before we go any further, I'll ask you for a favor. Like the video, subscribe to my channel, and leave a comment below this video with what time you listened to this story. She first noticed it the way you notice a draft, small, unavoidable, a disturbance you blame on the house aging, and not on the fact that you are awake and alone. The tapping began after midnight, a measured, knobby noise, as if fingers or a stick were drumming in the dark. It took on texture in the quiet soft, then hard, punctuating the hush of her late-night tea, and the hollow tick of the wall clock. It matched the cadence of her pulse, so often that she would check mechanically, hand on her throat, counting the beats until they mirrored the floor's insistence, and she could no longer be sure which rhythm belonged to which body. She put a microphone where she slept, an old recorder with a red light she liked, because it made the room seem practical and under control. Playback revealed things that were not simply noises. Beneath the tick and the wood's complaint, there was a tiny breath, like a mouth blown across a tiny bone. And then, softer than a thought, a whisper, her name. The recording caught it clipped and close. A thing so intimate she felt it as a warm smear of dust on her cheek. That whisper was shaped like the syllables she used for herself, half-formed and hungry for recognition. Once she heard it as evidence, denial became impossible. She began hunting the sound with an awkward kind of fascination. She knelt on the warped pine, the varnish smelling sharp and grown in the cracks, and pressed her ear to a loose board until the tapping answered. It never came from the same place twice. When she moved, the pattern shifted as if following her. She spoke aloud a string of small lies, foolish statements meant to test the phenomenon. I don't hear you, I am not scared, there's nothing under here. Each time, the tapping returned the lie, a heartbeat later, but in a voice that had been gone for a long time, childlike, grainy, and wrong like old paper read off a radio. With the wrong frequency drawers opened revealed ghosts in paper. She found yellowed sketches folded into cigarette boxes, pencil lines mapping the house as if seen from inside a skull. Circles were scrawled under the floor in frantic ovals, annotations in cramped, vertical handwriting, crawl space, access here, voice. A stack of voicemail tapes lay bent and dusty, old cassette tapes with dates handwritten and days circled. When she played them, the messages were the kind that age keeps, breathy, tremulous, static, hugging every consonant. Some tapes held only silence deepened by hiss. One had a child's laugh that halted like a struck bell. Another carried a woman's whisper that wound into the same cadence the recorder had captured in her bedroom. Every time she probed, the tapping learned. It learned pace. It learned hesitation. It learned to mimic the almost silent words she mouthed when she told herself comforting lies. She lifted boards and found nothing but the raw earth, rubble, and the long dead smell of insulation, she left recorders at doorways, setting them like traps, only to find the machines capturing phrase fragments she had not said aloud, but had thought. The place under the floor did not cancel out privacy so much as collected. The small private phrases she muttered to stay sane became feed. On a recorder left in the hall, she later heard herself saying, "I will not be afraid," my voice raw and solitary. And then a chorus of those words echoed, flattened into a child's tone that made the hair along her arms stand up like frozen bristles. Sometimes the tapping seemed to practice her footsteps. A coy mimic, she would pace a path across the parlor, and the knocks would fold into the cadence, following her across boards as if a hand were inside the timbers, measuring her. It had an intelligence that felt like a patient animal waiting to be seen, learning the map of her life through sound. When she played loved songs on a broken record player, the tapping settled into a rhythm that mirrored the melody's pulse. She suspected a trick of acoustics at first, the way a house could be an instrument, but the whispering voice, her name, breathed close, offered another explanation. Sound could not love the shape of her name the way that thing did. Sound did not call a name as if tasting it. Her nights acquired a schedule. She learned that the louder the radio, the slower the tapping grew, as if the thing beneath withdrew in embarrassment. When silence returned, the taps increased in confidence. She set a pillow over a gap in the floor and, petulant with fatigue, left it half open, testing again. The next morning, the pillow was moved a thumb's width, and the sleeping imprint of a small weight had been made in the stuffing. The board's edges displayed light scuff marks, like the careful work of a creature measuring the world by what it could pry open. She told no one. Some intimacies were too strange to name aloud without being branded either mad or melodramatic. And there is a private terror in being the only one who has to sleep with the sound. She tried to be clinical. She cataloged times and patterns, wrote down the sequences in a notebook, drew timelines in ink, while the house hummed its underbreath. When she crossed rooms, the tapping lagged, the way a recorder lags after a loud clap. Sometimes it anticipated her, answering before she spoke, a theft of causality that made her consider what other small liberties the dark was taking. She left a light on in the hallway and watched the glow throw the floor into bands. The tapping moved in guarded ticks along the bands like a patient insect. It learned the way dust settled on her favorite chair. It learned the hollow of her favorite shoe. It learned to stop when she pressed her palm flat to the wood, as if acknowledging an unspoken truce. On a rain-heavy night, the house complaining with the wind, she found a tape jammed behind the baseboard, labeled with a date from decades before she had owned the place. The handwriting on the sticker was not like any she knew. The ink had the slow unevenness of someone writing by candle. She took a breath and fed the tape into her old player. The screen breathed to life, and a voice came through, thin as paper, attempting her voice and failing. until it landed somewhere terrifyingly like the truth. The words were not new. They were things people said in private rooms. I am alone, wake me, tell me I am not stupid. The voice practiced tones, shaping themselves into the mournful cadence of someone learning to wear a borrowed face. The thing's mimicry was not perfect. Timing quivered around vowels. It missed the little punctuation marks of human speech, those staccato breaths, and private, irrelevant sounds we think no one else would recognize. It learned to reproduce the sounds that mattered most: names, the soft cadences of apology, the habitual lullabies she used to soothe herself. It did not learn the scent of lemon or the minute crease at the corner of her left thumb, for now its domain was sound, and sound was intimate enough. She provoked it in ways she had never provoked anything. She said absurdities to the floor. There are wolves in the rafters, my hair is blue, I cut my hair last week. Impossible confessions that made her laugh breathless and tight. The taps would stutter as if puzzled. And then, in that wrong child's voice, the house would answer her lie, turning it sour and patient. The more absurd the lie, the sweeter and slower the mimicry became, as if the thing under the wood was savoring the texture of a particular falsehood. Sometimes the tapping learned to be tender on nights when she let grief have her, letting memories ghost through her like moths around a lamp. The tapping would soften into a lull, matching the cadence of her softest thoughts. It replicated the small comforts she had once been given: the rhythm of a hand rubbing her back, the low voice that used to say everything would be all right. Those were the nights she woke with tears on her face, and the memory that something had called her a name in a voice that used to be held by someone who smelled of lavender. She threw the covers off quickly and flung her limbs to the floor as if she could chase the thing out with motion alone. Motion did not chide the tapping. Motion taught it new patterns. The more she learned, the more the house kept secrets for her. It listened to the small betrayals she practiced in private, white lies to lovers, the lie to herself that she was okay, and echoed them back in a warped chorus that made privacy ghost into performance. She became fastidious with sound the way some people become fastidious with knives. She hummed different tunes to confuse it. She left a radio set to a station that spoke no English and watched the tapping adopt an improvised syncopation that sounded like punctuation for foreign syllables. In the morning, she found the loose board shifted a fraction, as if the thing under had been rearranging its furniture to better hear at night. She began to test the thin moral boundary between curiosity and cruelty. She would whisper the names of people she missed into the floor, as if offering them up. Sometimes the tapping answered with silence. Sometimes it coughed up a voice that could have belonged to a neighbor's lost relative, imperfect and eager to please. She couldn't tell whether she was rescuing those voices or training a predator. The house did not care. It kept its patient lesson, teaching by mimicry and time. It was learning her, and in learning, it became less a question and more an approaching presence. By the time she realized the sounds were not only learning, but practicing for something else, the house had already taught her too many details to be innocent. The floor knew her rhythm. The floor knew the syllables she loved and the ones she hated. The floor could call her by a voice she had not heard in years and make her believe, if only for a second, that the past had come back to stroke her hair. She began to imagine what happened next with a kind of stubborn precision. What an answered knock would feel like on her own chest. How tightly a small, bony hand could grip a wrist. Whether a whisper could cross from under the wood to the skin like a nettle. Fear tightened around choices the way a string tightens around a throat. Patient and waiting, she recorded more. She documented patterns. She told herself she would not be surprised, that she would be ready for anything the dark decided to bring up through the floorboards. But readiness is not the same as knowing. There is a difference between collecting evidence and being prepared to meet what it proves. She pounded notes into a notebook, circles and dates, and beneath the ink she could feel, like a low hum through the table, the patient gathering of something that had been learning since before she moved in. The tapping answered her pen like a metronome, keeping time, patient and exact. The thing beneath the floor had become very practiced at waiting. She held him down with the dull, instinctive strength of someone who has learned to keep a secret in place. His fingers dug into the underside of the plank. They were knuckles and paper skin, animal in their panic. He tasted of dust and old breath, and when she forced his head up, he tried, with a queer, practiced eagerness, to speak the syllables shed, left echoing in the house. At first, the words were fractured, childlike vowelings, a gravelly wrongness. But then, the cadence snapped into something intimate. "Mama, are you awake?" It was not her mother's voice. Not exactly. It was a skillful mirror of grief and habit. She kept him there. Until the uniforms arrived, she kept him, because some part of her wanted to hear everything else he could make into her. The policeman looked at the floor like it might be a wound. He frowned at the loose board and at the prints of fingernails, white as the underside of a leaf. They asked her questions in the kitchen, where the light blotched the laminate like a bruise, and she answered them with a flat, factual voice, saying the same words she had already said into the recorder a dozen times. The man, pale as pollen, was driven away with his knees trembling and his eyes flicking between the wooden ribs of the house, as if he expected them to rise and follow him. Someone read him his rights, while his mouth kept shaping voices that did not belong to him. In the back of the cruiser, his head lolled against the glass, and he hummed, low and obscene with imitation, until the radio masked him with its static. When the door closed and their footsteps receded, the house sighed in the peculiar way old wood does when it returns to itself. It was a careful, heavy silence, and for the first night in months, she slept with the boards. Even beneath her mourning came thin and gray, and the world smelled of coffee and damp paper. She ate toast, and pressed new nails into the plank until the metal sang and took hold. Until the board lay flat and honest, she boxed the voicemail tapes and the yellowed sketches into a plastic tub and left it on the porch for the police to collect. She watched the sergeant lift the lid and peer at a drawing where the circles were so dark they bleeding into the page. He said nothing about it. His mouth went thin and he looked away, like someone who has been instructed not to ask why a house remembers. After they left, the quiet stretched until she could hear the sigh of paint settling on the window frame. She allowed herself small, brittle pleasures. The way sun warmed the rug, the precise clack of her coffee mug on ceramic, but the house had been taught to listen. It had learned cadence, the architecture of a breath, the private hum of her bones. 2 nights later, she woke to a sound like a small tapping beneath the sleeper's rhythm of the neighborhood, patient, metrical, and then the unmistakable soft press of a whisper curling into the space where her hair rested on the pillow. Her name, said in a tone that was exactly the way she said it when she was 8 and still slept with the light on, gentle, accusatory, and oddly affectionate. She sat up so fast the sheets wrapped around her like a snare. The tapping paused, then resumed in a rhythm matched to her breathing. Her phone showed 3 missed calls from the station. She listened to the voicemail. The sergeant's voice was normal, professional. And then at the end, like a hitch in a record, the line folded and a different timbre filled the space. It was soft, attentive. It was her own voice, but stretched thin and rehearsed, the tiny vowels she used when she pronounced a secret, the private rounding of her lips when she softened a phrase to keep someone calm. The voicemail ended with a single, quiet instruction. Check under the left side of the porch after midnight. No call sign, no explanation, just enough command to be dressed in concern. She almost laughed, then called the station back. The line clicked. A dispatcher answered, and then said, apologetically, that there had been no one scheduled, no patrol to leave such a message. Midnight made the world thinner. She wrapped herself in a sweater and went to the porch, where the air tasted of iron, and the moon was a distant, indifferent coin. Beneath the left side, she found not a person, but a small, tumbled construction of shredded fabric and bone-white clamps of something like cartilage. The thing breathed in the dark. It had learned to fold shadows into itself. It did not scrub the air with want, but with curiosity. It tested the night with tiny claws and brought back syllables like shells to its ear. She saw then that it was not one thing, but a small colony of learning, motes of imitation, pressed together the way detritus glues into something bigger. A man had been the first, but other parts remained, scraps of child's mutter, a neighbor's sleepy chuckle, the sergeant's clipped ending. She backed away until the porch rail was cold against her palm. It felt obscene to breathe the same air as something that could fold her voice into its mouth. She took photos, because that is what people do now. Because images are talismans, but the camera flattened it into shapes. and lost the motion. The way its attention bobbed like a blind thing, sampling currents. In the morning, she called her sister and told her not to come over. She left a message with the neighbor and signed up for an alarm company that promised 2 men on call, armored and swift. They combed the crawl space and found old stashes, handmade dolls with faces chewed off, clippings of newspaper so old the dates had gone soft, a child's sweater with a name stitched in faded thread. The man denied everything in the holding cell at first. He said he had been hiding, that he had nowhere else to go. Then he closed his eyes, and the voice like her mother slipped out of his mouth, flawless, and his hands trembled as if remembering how to play with dolls. They kept him in custody a few nights. Then a judge released him with ankle monitoring and quiet warnings that sounded like invitations. When he left, he did not look back, but what he had taught the house remained, a vocabulary of timbres and inflections that did not vanish with a human body weeks slipped. The alarm company sent men who checked doors and knots in the joists. Neighbors knocked and left casseroles wrapped in tinfoil. She learned to sleep with the light half on and to answer the phone with measured politeness. At night, the tapping came sometimes, but it was more careful now. It tried to hide the way it shaped syllables when the company was awake. It practiced on the quiet. One night, months on, she found the recorder she had left under the sofa. She had meant it as experiment, a trap for the thing. Instead, it had become a diary. She played it alone in the kitchen, hands cupped around the device like a lit candle. At first, there was only the hum of the refrigerator and the small rustle of city life. Then the tape turned, and slow as a tide, some syllables began to collect. A neighbor humming, a radio jingle, the sergeant's clipped voice, and then her own private laugh when she had been talking to a cat. It moved like a student copying, handwriting it, never once invented a cadence, only learned to fold others' habits into itself. Near the end of the tape, there is a long, patient silence. She can hear her own breathing, measured and tired. Then a whisper so close it feels like a hand on her cheek. It says, in a voice she knows from childhood, "Come down." The invitation is almost naked in its pleading. It is not cruel, only hungry for contact. She shuts the recorder off and sits for a long time. The house is ordinary in the daytime, but she understands now that ordinariness was what it wanted most. She begins to answer differently. She speaks aloud to empty rooms in odd headlines. She practices phrases in the mirror, meaningless sentences she hopes the house will ignore. The mailman likes jazz. The plants prefer sunlight. I will not open the back door. Sometimes the tapping becomes playful, at others it is cruelly precise, returning the exact lie she told to herself that morning, mocking the small, private folds of her mind. She learns to live around the listening, but every so often the house remembers and calls her name. If you want her to keep listening, like and subscribe.